Member for Columbia River, Revelstoke.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's great to be back. Yesterday, I sat, having talked about some of the revenue and non-existent revenue streams that this government was touting, and all the taxes that British Columbians are paying today that they weren't paying 3 years ago, and reminded them that they can't tax people into prosperity. What I'd like to do, Mr. Speaker, is to continue my talk focused on the people of Columbia River Revelstoke and talk a little bit about the forestry industry. It's a sector, as we all know, that is in crisis with massive layoffs and shutdowns that have been announced consistently through the NDP term and their government. More than 100 mill curtailments and 10 permanent and indefinite shutdowns in 2019. And the minister himself, and I quote, says it's not a crisis. The parliamentary secretary said that there are too many mills. The premier said the communities, and I quote, are spoiled children. People's lives are falling apart, Mr. Speaker, and they say this. That's all they have to say about the forestry industry. When the minister made his $69 million announcement to aid forestry workers in September, little did we know that instead of new money for the workers, displaced workers, it was simply taking money away from other key projects. Key projects, a fund that they call, and I quote, a slush fund. The $25 million that was taken from the Rural Dividend Fund was established by our government to help rural communities diversify their local economies. Monies that those communities have come to depend upon. Monies that were applied through extensive applications, a lot of work by volunteer organizations, and many of those organizations who are dependent upon the forest industry. Well, that special fund was a hit for all over British Columbia. It's over 300 communities benefiting annually. So they actually took away money from one and gave to another under the guise of it's helping the forestry industry while hurting other British Columbians, like the Community Futures Group in Revelstoke, who spent an enormous amount of time putting an application together for naught. But it's come to a stop because the minister raised the fund to cover the costs of an inadequate forestry aid program, Band-Aids while the body is hemorrhaging. The member from Oak Bay, Gordon Head, in this very House, said, and I quote, that the forestry crisis should be non-partisan, unquote. Well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? We agree. We proposed a 5-point action plan months and months and months ago that would have provided tax relief and assistance to the forestry workers throughout this province that are losing their jobs or have lost their jobs. But the NDP chose to ignore it. It's hard to work with others. It's hard to work with others when they refuse to work with anybody but themselves and believe in their own philosophy. And then, Mr. Speaker, they talk about free trade. Well, free trade, specifically with the United States, requires participation. Just recently, Western premiers and other premiers and individuals went to the United States to work with the Americans, to meet with the Americans, to promote their economies, to promote the place that they live. Premier Jason Kenney, Premier Scott Moe, both Alberta and Saskatchewan were part of that delegation. They went to the United States to fight for their people, to represent their people, to talk about their people's story to the Americans, to understand that we are still good trading partners. That's what they're paid to do. That's the job a leader does. My question, where was the Premier of the province of British Columbia? Why was he not there? Yet 2.5 years ago, he said he would be the champion for British Columbians to the Americans. Now, he's the invisible man. Mr. Speaker, they talk competition. They actually said the word competition. Yet they don't understand that investors are running from this country. I used an example yesterday of a small little village that I represent in my riding. who's had a major developer come in and investors and said, we want to do this, and it's a great opportunity to grow and develop more area and attract more people into the region. Those investors said, we're not going to do it. It's too uncertain in this province. We don't trust this government. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? That development is on hold right now. They're running from it. And they talk competition. In the next breath, they put out the collective benefits agreement. Yesterday, I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that on the Kicking Horse Canyon expansion itself, one of the most expensive road projects anywhere in the history of Canada on the Trans-Canada Highway, $30 million dedicated to the community benefits agreement. I also mentioned yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the struggle that not only my community, Columbia River Revelstoke, but the two peace ridings, the Kootenay East riding, are struggling with medical care out in the hinterlands. Denied in Alberta, non-access to treatments in Kelowna. Well, $30 million, Mr. Speaker, $30 million could go to building a radiation therapy facility in Cranbrook. Another one could go to one in Trail. 2 therapy units that could be built in the Kootenays that could have been done so if the community benefits agreement wasn't in effect. My constituents and myself, Mr. Speaker, are struck by how many NDP provinces have been left on the cutting room floor at the expense of British Columbians. People around this province, specifically in my riding, are finding life not more affordable, but more unaffordable. ICBC rates, hydro rates, everything has gone up. The price of gas continues to escalate, and the cracks are showing in their government and in their economic plan. They have no economic plan. There's no job plan. There's no plan except to tax, and spend. How can you possibly run a province without a plan that generates revenue? How can you possibly do that, Mr. Speaker? Life is not affordable here anymore. The investors are running, and they have the rhetoric over on that other side that it's just kumbaya. People have had it in my constituency. They're worried, they're scared for their own jobs, and they want to know what they can do. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's going to be a reckoning, and that reckoning is going to come in the next election, and it will be at the expense of those fine people across the aisle at the voter booths. There will be a reckoning, and as far as we're concerned in my riding, Mr. Speaker, it can't come soon enough. So with that, I will take my seat and say without question, I will not support this budget.